Allow me to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Phyllis Zee. She's the professor of neurology, neurobiology, and physiology, and the director of Sleep Disorder Center and the ACGME Accredited Sleep Medicine Fellowship Program. She is also the associate director at the Center for Sleep and Circadian Biology at Northwestern University Institute for Neuroscience in Chicago, Illinois. Please give a warm Academy welcome to Dr. Phyllis Zee.
Thank you for that introduction, and I especially want to thank the IAOMT, but also Dr. Fisher for inviting me. I was in the elevator last night, coming in very late from New York, and met one of your colleagues, and he says, "So what do you do?" I said, "I'm a neurologist, and I'm a sleep specialist." And he says, "Are you here for this meeting?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Why? Why? What are you gonna? Why are you here?" So I hope that by the end of this lecture, I will give you some idea as to why circadian rhythms, clearly sleep, as you all know, is very relevant, not just to your own personal health, but certainly that of the health of your patients. I do have a disclosure slide here, which is that I have research grants from Philips Respironics, which makes CPAP machines and also is interested in the sleep field. I'm a consultant for several industries such as Merck, UCB, Jazz, and Vanda. All pharmaceutical companies were involved in the sleep market. And I also have stock ownership, not me personally, but my husband has stock ownership in Teva. I don't do stocks, but he does. So what I like to do is give you a really broad overview of this emerging field of circadian biology, which I think is really one of the future areas in medicine overall, but certainly also in sleep medicine. So we'll review very quickly some of the neurobiology of circadian rhythms and how it may be regulated. We're going to look at how circadian rhythm, and particular dysfunction of circadian rhythmicity, will be affecting adverse health outcomes. And I'll throw in some oral medicine in here as much as I can. And then really for us to recognize how it's important to think about this in our patients and ourselves as a method perhaps for prevention and as well as for treatment of health-related problems in our patients. And just as the earlier speaker talked about oxidative stress, talked about inflammation, you will hopefully see how circadian biology has everything to do with both inflammation, oxidative stress, and that may be one of the mechanistic pathways by which we can relate circadian biology, sleep, back to oral health. So there are these two major processes that regulate sleeping wakefulness, and really, in fact, I think most, if not all, of the physiological process that you see. So we can start with something that we know very well. It's called a homeostatic drive for sleep. All of us who are here woke up this morning, and your brain and your neurons begin to build this substrate. And much of that, there's several of these, but one of them is a metabolic substrate called adenosine, which is also very important for ATPs, very important for the formation of energy. That begins to build outside of your neurons the moment you wake up, and the longer you're awake, the more adenosine builds up in your brain and your neurons. How many of you had caffeine this morning? Or some type of caffeine, right? Okay, great. Caffeine is an adenosine receptor antagonist. So it's working on this homeostatic mechanism to make you more alert by combating this buildup of the adenosine that occurs. So it gets higher and higher, and you get sleepier and sleepier as the day goes by. But of course, you're not falling asleep right now, and you're not going to be falling asleep, hopefully, by this evening before your wonderful dinner, because there's another process that builds up during the day, and that's called the circadian process, a circadian near 24-hour rhythm that not only produces timing information, but it produces alerting signal. So this is what's kind of trying to keep you up during the day, and in the evening hours, right before you go to bed, that signal for alertness is the highest, combating this increasing signal for sleepiness that's building up in your brain. And at night, this circadian clock signal begins to go down. These neurons decrease their firing rate, and that then allows you to dissipate your sleep during the night. So your drive, your homeostatic drive for sleep, dissipates during sleep, and in part it's generated by this decrease in the alerting signal that is coming in from your circadian system. At the same time, this circadian clock system at night is producing this hormone called melatonin. It sends a signal to the pineal gland to produce melatonin. And when melatonin rises during the night, it's also a signal to increase sleepiness. It increases sleepiness, but also decreases the firing rate of these neurons in the clock system, which I will show you in just a little bit. So most of us are best asleep somewhere between, let's say, 10 p.m. and that of the early morning hours, and we're really, really sleepiest right before we actually have to wake up, right? You wonder, why am I so sleepy when I wake up in the morning when I've just slept all night? Well, because your clock system, your circadian system for alertness is still very low. You're going to be best after I finish my talk. So circadian rhythms are truly a fundamental process of living organisms. You have to evolve this because our Earth rotates around the sun, and that creates a very, very close to 24-hour physical environment. In all biological systems, single cells, organisms from single cells to complex beings like us, we have to adjust our internal rhythm, which is generated internally, with that of the light-dark cycle. What we know very excitingly, and this is the great science, it's one of the most wonderful examples, I think, of systems biology, is that we know these near 24-hour rhythms internally in our body is generated at a molecular level. It's a very simple molecular genetic process. It's not driven by the sun. It's not driven by waves, microwaves out there. It's really generated internally. Every cell contains clocks. Every single cell of your body contains clocks. And then we'll talk finally about what goes wrong with the clocks when there's a misalignment between your internal clock time and that of the external environment, such as those who are jet laggers or shift workers, and how that may have an impact on not just normal physiology, but also perhaps disease. So the first demonstration that these circadian or near 24-hour circadian rhythms were generated internally was actually in 1729 by a botanist named by Jack Demarian. He saw that this is the mimosa plant, and he said this mimosa plant opens its leaves during the day when there's light, and it closes its leaves during the evening, during the night, when there is no light. And he says, I wonder if it's driven by light, or is there something internal? Is there an internal clock in this plant? Very simple experiment. So he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put this plant in a box below, and I'm going to stop it so that there is no light getting into this box at all. We're going to put them right underneath this other plant, and let's now observe in total darkness whether this plant opens its leaves and closes its leaves. And what he found was that, lo and behold, this plant, even in total darkness, opened its leaves at the right time of the day when there normally would be sun and light, and it closes leaves during the night, not driven by the external light-dark cycle. So there was first demonstration. He said there must be then internal clocks. There must be a clock that's internal to this. This is near 24 hours that is just ticking biologically on its own. Now, this is many years later, and certainly now we know that almost Every rhythm, every physiological process, molecular process, cellular process, whether it's in your teeth, whether it's in the mucosa of your oral cavity, has a circadian rhythm. And these are just some simple things that you may probably recognize. So you look around here, midnight, your deepest sleep occurs right before, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, depending whether you're a night owl or an early bird. Your lowest core body temperature is a beautiful circadian rhythm to core body temperature, high during the day. It's actually getting higher now, and very low during the night when you're actually sleeping. Your blood pressure begins to go up before you wake up. It doesn't go up because you stood up. Because if it only went up when you stand up, you probably will fall and you may pass out. So it prepares you to wake up, prepares you to stand. Your cortisol rhythm begins to rise a few hours before you actually wake up as well. Melatonin, which we talked about earlier, is only up at night, and during the morning it actually decreases, so you have very little, if any, melatonin, hopefully right now. Bowel movements, we all are interested in this as we get older. Many of you look very young, but as you get older, you talk about your bowel movements. They're in the morning, so it's good that they don't occur in the middle of the night, because then you have to wake up and go to the bathroom. And many of these functions allows you to protect your sleep during the night. So very few things. You don't eat at night, for example, unless you have an eating disorder of some sort. It's a protection from that. Not only is physiology, but your behavior changes, your performance changes, your best coordination. I tell this to my faculty. I say, you got to know my rhythm if you want to get the best out of me. If you want to ask me for a raise, or when I want to ask my chairman for a raise, know his or her rhythm, because you may want to get them at their lowest point or their highest point, depending what you want to ask them. And so your performance, your reaction time, your mood changes across the day, your blood pressure, and so forth. So this is just not an exhaustive list of the physiology, but everything has this diurnal rhythm. Going a little further, look at blood pressure. In the yellow bar here are the normal sleep time. But this would occur even if the individual was not sleeping. So I take you and I totally sleep deprive you, poke you every, so often, say, don't sleep, don't sleep. You will still have these rhythms. It may be a little more blunted, but you will still have the circadian rhythm. Blood pressure, high during the day, low during the nighttime, your biological night, even insulin. So this is a study where what we did was we gave people not in response to meals. This is not insulin in response to meals. This is giving somebody a continuous level of glucose through an IV. And you still see a beautiful circadian rhythm to insulin. Higher during the day, lower during the night. You don't want insulin to be high during the night because you're fasting, right? You don't want to be hypoglycemic. So it's really an incredible orchestra of fine-tuning everything. Melatonin, again, you see this beautiful thing. Core body temperature high during the day, begins to rise before you actually wake up, again, to prepare you for waking. Mood show this beautiful circadian rhythm, whether it's happiness or cheerfulness, in particular, alertness. How you learn during the day is related to circadian timing as well. And leptin, I show you here because we'll talk about it in a little bit. It's a hormone that is important as an appetite regulator. So when you're full, leptin levels are high, and it tells you stop eating. There's a circadian rhythm to leptin. You see, it's high during the normal sleep period, during the night, so that you don't wake up and get hungry. You actually can sleep your 6 or 7 hours during the night without having to wake up and eat like you do during the day. Every 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours, you're hungry again. And when you dysregulate the system, you can imagine now, you're going to get hungry at night, and that could be a road to obesity, which I will talk about in just a little bit. Just another example. This is across a 24-hour period. You can see how mood shows a beautiful rhythm, lowest during the night, so certainly you don't want to be talking to your spouse in the middle of the night and trying to, discuss something. that may make him or her more irritable. You want to do it at the higher end here. Same thing with alertness, learning. This has a lot to do with our children who are teenagers. You know, how many of you have teenagers as children? How many of you have been teenagers? Okay. So, you know, they don't like to go to sleep, right? I mean, they sleep late, many of them. They can't wake up in the morning to go to... And yet we're putting them in school in the morning at a time that's really an adverse circadian time for them. So there's a national movement right now to delay school time in high school to start at least at 8 or perhaps a little bit later. Because they're not learning. Every high school teacher can tell you the morning class is horrible. Half of the kids are asleep in the morning class, and this may have a lot to do with the circadian rhythm, but also learning. We'll talk a little bit about that. What about performance? Now, this is a great study. That's what it's called a Martini study. And what they did was they looked at relative performance, vigilance performance, and here is blood alcohol concentration. They took young people and they said, okay, you can either be in the sleep deprivation arm or you can be in the Martini arm. And so many said, I want to be in the Martini arm, but you know, it was a randomized trial, so they couldn't choose to do that. And you look at, so they drank martinis, they drank alcohol across the day to get to a blood alcohol level that was within the toxic range, 0.05 and 0.1. Legally intoxicated. And then this is the number of hours of wakefulness. And you can see what's happening here is that it's not so bad here. Boom, boom, boom. You know, you're awake. After 16 hours or so of continuous wakefulness, our performance begins to plummet. And it plummets really rapidly. So that after 20-some hours of being awake, like 21 hours, you are working in this range here of somebody, performance-wise, of somebody who is legally intoxicated. Okay? Now you would say, well, this is sleep deprivation, and this is the case. You're reaching your lowest point. This is why in the ACGME training programs, there's an 80-hour work week, and now for interns is no more than 16 continuous hours of work. Based on this type of science. But of course, I have an article in JAMA that says good science does not necessarily lead to good policy, okay, because there's a lot more to it. But then look what's really interesting. You would think you get worse and worse and sleepier because you've been sleep deprived. They're still sleep deprived at 27, 29 hours. But look what happens. Without any extra sleep, performance increases, alertness increases again. That's the circadian clock kicking in, okay? That's the circadian alertness signal kicking in despite the fact that there's all that sleep deprivation. It's very powerful, and we believe that this is performance. Here are soldiers in the middle of the day, and they're sleeping. Okay, they're sleeping. This is how powerful the system is. And not talking about crashes, of course, also in medicine. So what are these rhythms? Where are they generated? There's a lot of evidence now. In fact, this is the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the circadian clock system. These circadian rhythms are generated by an internal clock or pacemaker located in the brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus because it sits right above the optic chiasm and is located in the hypothalamus. We know they're under genetic regulation. This clock regulates circadian rhythms, and because these circadian rhythms are never exactly 24 hours, they need to be synchronized to the light-dark cycle, our physical social activities. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the beauty of it is that we can manipulate these circadian rhythms by light therapy and or melatonin therapy and or perhaps physical exercise. We can move them up, we can move them back, we can actually shift these rhythms. I'm sorry that if you don't have this presentation, this will be available to you as well, so it may not be in your thing. So how do we know this little nuclei in the brain is a master clock? Well, we do these studies. These are hamsters. They're very, very cute. This is work that I did as a postdoc. Well, you see, here's a mouse, here's a hamster or a mouse. It could be any of these. And a wild type, you can see this animal is hopping on the wheel. This is wheel running activity, hopping on the wheel every day in total darkness. And every day hops on the wheel, each line of this, by a little bit later. So this animal's period, circadian period, is 24 point, let's say 1 or 2 hours. It hops on the wheel a little bit later every day, has no idea what time it is externally except for the internal clock. You lesion the suprachiasmatic nucleus in this animal, and here's the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a paired nuclei. You lose the rhythmicity, the 24-hour rhythmicity. They become arrhythmic. You don't see this pattern anymore. We can also take an animal that has this mutation, that has a period of 20 hours, and then what we do is we take their SCN out of this animal that has a very, very short period, and we transplant it into an animal that has a very normal period, and that animal begins to show a period that is also like the donor animal. So we know that this clock system in this area of the brain contains a master clock that determines the periodicity of your rhythm. We also know that in humans, the rhythm, not like animals being very, very close to 24 hours, in humans it's actually varied. So each of these lines represents one human being, and we're looking at the time of their melatonin onset, when melatonin rises during the night. This is across 28 days. So this is done at Harvard by Dr. Seisler's group, where they lock up people for 28 days in these constant conditions at the Brigham. And so these people, they don't know what time of the day it actually is. So they just let them drift. These are like bunker studies. And you can see in this person, the melatonin, this is just one marker of the internal clock timing, is getting earlier and earlier and early. That would be an owl. That would be some of my colleagues here who go to bed at 9 or 8 or something like that, and wake up at 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning, are perfectly fine. Their circadian clock is running a little bit shorter than 24 hours. So their biological day is less than 24 hours. So they tend to be always a little bit earlier. Most of the people are right here in the middle. They're very close to 24 hours, but most humans are about 24.2 hours. So if I would put any one of you in a cave, which, the Mammoth Caves in Kentucky, what you would begin to see is that every day you're going to wake up and all your physiological rhythms that we talked about are going to occur about 0.1 or 0.2 hours later every day. You're just going to go into a non-entrained condition, what we call free run. And then there are these individuals out here that have a longer period, or their circadian oscillation, their clock is oscillating a little bit longer, they're getting later and later, and these are going to be your owls here. This is going to be your owls who, can't fall asleep until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and then they can't wake up in the morning, or they really are very tired in the morning because their circadian period is longer than 24 hours, so they're always a little bit later. So this is what we call chronotypes, circadian chronotypes, the owls and the larks. And now you know that there's a circadian, a physiological genetic basis for why you are owl or lark, not just because you're a little bit lazy and can't get up in the morning, which is what we think about most of our people. So what do we know now about the molecular generation of this? This is one of the greatest examples how complex mammalian behavior, when you wake up, when you fall asleep, all your timing of your physiology can be explained by a genetic mechanism. So we know that the circadian rhythms are genetically regulated, and this came from a study where at Northwestern in Dr. Takahashi's laboratory, they found that on chromosome number 5 of a mouse that when you substitute a base pair T for A, okay, usually it's AT, and then you mess it up and call it TA, okay, that breaks down this clock. And I think I have a slide to show you what that may look like. So here's a wild type animal, a mouse. This is normal. They free run with a period that's a little bit shorter than 24 hours, a little bit earlier every day. This mutation, this A to T-based substitution in the chromosome, in the gene, causes animal to be this type of an animal to an animal with a period that is extremely long, never seen in nature. This was a point mutation that was induced by this thing called what we call ENU mutagenesis. And this symbol pair substitution is the first demonstration of a complex behavior such as this that can actually be done by one single change in the gene. Since then, this is 1997, we have discovered many more circadian or clock genes, and they keep coming. There's many more than 11 now that regulate the system. And let me just show you in the next slide a very simplified version of the core mechanism that generates these near 24 hours in your body, in every cell that contains DNA. So here's the nucleus, here's the cytoplasm. This is the gene that was discovered at Northwestern called clock. We sat around, I was a postdoc at the time. We probably had a few beers as well. And we said, what are we going to call this, this gene mutation? And with a few beers, we came up with the idea that it should be called circadian locomotor rhythms gone kaput. And it just turned out to look like clock, which is really, really great. And when clock, this gene, and BMAL, another circadian gene, they form a dimer. They sit on this e-box. They begin the translation of other circadian genes, in this case called the period gene, and also the cryptochrome gene called CRY, not really important to know. They produce proteins, right? And these proteins now exit the nucleus, enter into the cytoplasm. And in the cytoplasm, there are these kinases. For example, there are other ones, but one of them is called kinase epsilon, okay? And this kinase then phosphorylates the proteins. Once these proteins are phosphorylated, they're inactive, okay? They die. They're basically inactive. But of course, some of them begin to form a dimer again, the period protein, or the period and the CRY protein. When they dimerize in the cytoplasm, they go back, they re-enter the nucleus, and they shut their own production down. So how quickly, very simply said, how quickly these proteins are made, how quickly they get degraded in the cytoplasm, how quickly they re-enter the nucleus determines how fast your clock is going to run. Is it going to be a 23.9 hour clock, such as a super lark, or a super owl whose clock may be running at 25 hours rather than at 24 hours. And this machinery exists in every single cell of your body. So every single cell of your body has this clock mechanism. In fact, if you look at all the genes in your entire genome, human genome, entire body, 10% of all genes express our circadian rhythms. Okay? And that is a huge, huge number when you think about it. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is the big master clock in the brain, and that generates a big, powerful circadian rhythm that then, through the autonomic system, entrains all of these peripheral rhythms. So there are clocks in every tissue that contains DNA, in every tissue we have looked at. And I just put the teeth, the oral part right here. Very little work in this area, but I'll show you a little bit of this work. Pancreas, so a lot of interest in metabolism. The cardiologists are also going crazy with heart muscle, the circadian rhythms of heart muscle, and the molecular mechanism of endothelial function, for example. White blood cells, kidney, breast tissue, you can go on and on. But as I said earlier, this clock in humans is never exactly 24 hours. It's close, very close, 24.1, 0.2. So every day to be exactly 24 hours, so we can wake up predictably every day around the same time, we need to be entrained. And the most powerful entraining agent, the time giver for the circadian system, is the light-dark cycle. Light is extremely powerful. The circadian system is so important that it has its own photoreceptors, had its own photopigment. It's not the rods and cones necessarily, it's called the retinal ganglion cells. And they contain a photopigment called melanopsin. And the melanopsin is most sensitive to blue, green, blue range light, so short wavelength light. So if you want to not disturb somebody's sleep, you just have to give them red light, very long wavelength light at night. So I actually have my patients use red light night lights. You can still see pretty well. Blue is bad. It is not a coincidence that when somebody wants to get your attention, they give you blue light, right? Blue light specials or whatever you call them at Kmart, right? You go to Shanghai and underneath those bridges at 10 p.m., blue lights. Why? I said to the governor in Shanghai, why do you have all these blue lights in this? She goes, because I want people to see this from outer space. I want people to see that there is Shanghai right here with all these lights. Blue lights, okay? So there's something, our clock system sees this. It is the most alerting type of light, is this blue light. And this clock now receives this information. It's clicking itself from a molecular level, 24.1 hours, in training with this light-dark cycle with a direct path from the retina to this clock system. And it provides then timing information to many, many other areas of the brain. So the autonomic system affects the timing of all of these peripheral tissues, which are on their own clicking away because they have their own clocks. It also then, at night, helps to produce in the pineal gland melatonin, so patients, and it goes down, the signal goes down to the sympathetic system and back up. And melatonin is produced here in the pineal gland, and this is one of the reasons why patients on beta blockers may have insomnia. And those of you who have patients, ask them about beta blockers. If they can't sleep well, perhaps because beta blockers will block melatonin completely. And melatonin, once secreted, actually also feeds back to the clock like light, but it's the body's dark signal. Light, melatonin is the body's dark signal, also can affect the timing of the circadian clock. We also now know that appropriately timed physical activity, vigorous physical activity, can change the timing of the clock, and we also know that food can change the timing of the clock, especially fats. Very interestingly, especially fats. At the right time of the day, especially if you get fats in the middle of the night, it can actually reset your clock in perhaps an adverse position. And I'll show you a little bit of data also on what it may have to do with oral health and oral medicine. So as I already said this a little bit earlier about melatonin being secreted from a signal from the suprachiasmatic nucleus to the pineal gland. What I did not say was the melatonin is suppressed by light. In the middle of the night, your melatonin is high, you turn on that light, boom, melatonin levels go down. And it is only secreted during the night. And this is going to be an interesting part. It has anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, very relevant to the previous talk. So just keep that in mind, in addition to its function as a sleep and wake regulator. And so here's a little bit of relevance. This is published in the Journal of Periodontology, which I don't read, but now I have read this. And what these authors did, they actually did a meta-analysis of the data of melatonin and its potential role in oral health. And so what they summarize from much of the data, again, most of these studies are small studies, are not, like great from a standpoint of scientifically rigorous studies, but yet what they were able to get from this literature was that melatonin, because of its antioxidant effects, may play a role in protecting the oral cavity from tissue damage due to oxidative stress, which is very important. They think that because it's only secreted during the night in darkness, and they know this is actually from in vitro studies, not so much in vivo studies, that it can stimulate the synthesis of type 1 collagen fibers and promotes the formation of bone. So this may be, of course, relevant to dentistry and to oral health. And underneath of that, The other set of data, the conclusion can be drawn that that melatonin may contribute to the regeneration of the alveolar bone through the stimulation of type 1 collagen, which we talked about a little bit earlier, production, and the modulation of both osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity. There is remodeling of bone and in the teeth during the night, okay? During the night of both osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity. And there is a hypothesis that melatonin may play a role in this. So now you can think, if you get a patient whose circadian rhythms are messed up, whose melatonin isn't going up at night, who is a shift worker perhaps, do you know, do shift workers have more periodontal disease? Do they have more problems with inflammation? Something for one of you to actually look at. Perhaps, I would imagine so. So now let's look at circadian rhythms in dentin increments. We talked about the suprachiasmatic nucleus being a site of the master circadian oscillator. So they took these animals, now mice, and they did an SCN lesion. They lesioned the master circadian clock. Okay, this is an unlesioned animal, the control animal. This is looking at dentin increments. And during the night, actually very interestingly, you will see these ridges where you can follow the dentin increments. The control group, you see a beautiful circadian rhythm, higher during the night, less so dentin increments during the day, beautiful in all of these days up to 19 days. The partially lesioned animal, still with a tiny bit of SCN left, because it's sometimes very hard to do it completely. In the first day you see it, and you can see almost a blunting of that rhythm of dentin increment. The rhythm is lost. Partial lesion here as well. So you can see different partial lesions in this. Here's a completely lesioned animal, and after 5 to 12 days, that rhythm, the circadian rhythm of dentin increments is lost. Okay. So this is really strong evidence that there is, one, a circadian rhythm to dentin increments, but also that the suprachiasmatic nucleus is regulating this, just like it's regulating all these other physiological rhythms. Let's move on to the genes, to the circadian clock genes. This is a study that shows that the circadian clock genes modulate enamel development. So as you know, I know very little about this, but there's this daily increments of enamel formation, and you can see this by the cross striations that you can actually see under the microscope. The amelogenin, I may not even be pronouncing this right, are made by these ameloblasts. And the most abundant of the matrix protein of enamel is this amelogenin. Can't pronounce this. And this data suggests, and I'll show you just in a little bit down here, circadian clock regulation of enamel development, and that the ameloblasts express clock genes, BMAL and cryptochrome. Remember, those were the two genes of the circadian core circadian machinery. This is stain for BMAL. This is expression. This is, I think, mRNA expression of BMAL. Here is cryptochrome, the other circadian clock gene, and here's the ameloblast layer. And you can see very high staining here. This is the same, just magnified for BMAL. And you see here staining of these cells for, this is cryptochrome, again magnified over here. Whereas if you looked at the control, you still see the layers for the ameloblast, but you don't see this here in the stratum intermedium, malleus, and or as well in the odontoblast. But also you see that here. So it's not just the ameloblast, but even the odontoblasts are expressing circadian clock genes in a rhythmic manner. So messing up circadian rhythms can mess up parts of this. Going further, this is now in the molars and mouse molars. You can see BMAL and another clock gene, which is the period gene, which we also mentioned earlier. You can see this beautiful rhythmic expression across the day of these transcripts in mouse molars. And you can see this both, and this is across, this is in constant conditions. And here during the light, during the dark phase, you can see this beautiful difference, not only in the period gene, in the BMAL gene, but also in the amelogenin gene expression here. You can see that that gene expression for this protein is also, that affects enamel, is actually also circadian. So the amylogenin gene is rhythmic, has circadian rhythmicity, and it's probably being driven by the clock genes, by the period genes. So there's that interaction. So now I hope that I've been showing you that there is relevance to oral health and oral medicine. It's just really there at the very beginning. So the classical view that we've had for circadian rhythms, and if I were to ask anybody in the street, they were like, you mean circadian? They don't really know that word. But then if they know anything about it, they think it's about sleep and performance and wakefulness. I want to take you, I think already, to the contemporary view, which is, of course, is important for sleep and wakefulness, but that it's really important for other brain regions, for peripheral tissues, including that, as I showed you earlier, of teeth remodeling, of bone remodeling during the day. So I want to show you a little bit of data of what goes wrong when there's circadian dysfunction or misalignment. There's a lot of data now to suggest that maybe the road to obesity, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, and other inflammatory disorders. And, I don't know how to go back now. I can go back. This is a nice picture. This is taken from space. What does it tell you? This is light. Doesn't matter whether you're on this hemisphere, up or low, high or low, east or west. And what you see is that there's light on Earth all the time. There is no night on Earth, right? It doesn't matter. And in the most populated areas, and I think this, like the mercury perhaps, it's really messing up our sleep, messing up our circadian cycles, and perhaps really contributing to health. The mechanisms that link circadian rhythm, sleep, with health is that we know with sleep deprivation and with circadian misalignment, when your internal rhythm and your external rhythm are out of sync, they can alter your appetite. How many of you have been up at 3 in the morning for whatever reasons? No? Yeah. At 3 or 2 in the morning, do you think, boy, do I wish I had a salad? Okay. It's not a coincidence that we eat certain things during certain times of the day, right? We don't eat a big steak in the morning. Well, some of us do if you're like Texas. I was in Texas and they were eating steak in the morning. So it alters your appetite. Impair glucose control. When your circadian rhythms are misaligned, for the same amount of food that you eat, your glucose levels are higher at certain times of the day. Your insulin is higher at certain times of the day than others. So like shift workers. Increased cortisol levels, which is bad for your teeth, which is bad for, in general health, and inflammation. Increased sympathetic activation, higher blood pressure. Increased markers of inflammation. All the cytokines are increased during this period of circadian misalignment. So let's talk about feeding first. I think we're all kind of interested in feeding. So we talked about the clock, the SCN. Light entrains this SCN. It modulates all these other brain regions, but not only that of sleep-wake cycle, it modulates rhythms and areas that are important for appetite. So as you can see from this, the suprachiasmatic nucleus sends signals down to some of these peripheral tissues. There may be more. I could put teeth right here as well, and oral cavity, but maybe next time I'll draw a line to that. And what you see is entrains these different tissues. But very importantly, your behavior, what you eat, also changes the timing of these clocks, both peripherally and centrally. And what happens here in the brain also determines what your appetite is for food. And this all related to sleep, but also very importantly to circadian function. So here are the teenagers, the young adults. They're staying up late. They have irregular sleep-wake timing. Look at that light. They're playing video games. Look at that light. This is at night, pitch darkness and all that light, badly timed light exposure, not enough exercise. This is a societal problem. And look at it, so I'm thinking, is this somehow related to, is this a road to perhaps obesity, depression, psychiatric disorders? This is data from the I think from, I'm not sure where, from the National Health Interview. So you look across the last, I guess, here 50 years, and this is the percent of people who are obese. Huge epidemic. We're very concerned about this. Look at sleep duration. It's going down. I'm not saying that they're related, but it's pretty interesting to see that. This is not science. This is just conjecture. But based on what we know now about the effect of sleep and circadian timing on things, it's important. So, went a little further. Oh, this is not going to be easy to go back to. I can't go back. Now it's on this automatic problem that we had before. Well, okay, I can't go back. I don't know how to go back on this. And it's going, can we stop this automatic thing? I guess maybe not. But anyways, okay. It doesn't matter. So what we did was we looked at, we know in animals that if you give meals at the wrong, if you fed a animal who's nocturnal during the day, that this animal, even if you give them exactly the same amount of calories, this animal within 1 week gains much more weight than an animal that is fed during the dark period. Okay? So we decided to do this in humans, and we said, okay, I'm a translational person, so I said, let's do this. So we asked about, I think it was about 50 people or so, to keep a sleep diary, wear a watch that looked at their sleep-wake cycles, and to keep a dietary diary. And then we divided these individuals into those who are normal, meaning that their midpoint of their sleep was probably somewhere between 2 and 5 o'clock in the morning, and those whose midpoint of sleep was after 5 a.m. So if your midpoint of sleep is after 5 a.m., you're usually going to bed around 2 or 3 and waking up around 9 or 10, okay? And normal. So we looked at caloric intake. What you can see very nicely is that the late folks, they don't eat very much in the morning, right? But, wow, do they catch up later on, and where do they catch up most? Right before they have to go to bed, okay? They eat much more after 8 p.m., and in fact, they eat 248 calories more per day. Wow. Whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot when you think about it, unless they're really exercising it off. That could be one of the problems here. So late sleepers eat late, obviously, but they also eat more. To the point, not only that the late sleepers eat more, they ate more fast foods. We looked at macronutrient content. They ate less fruits and vegetables, right? Obviously, you already know why. And they consume more full-calorie sodas. So it's not just that they ate at the wrong time. Eating at a time that is not right for your biological clock makes you eat bad food, makes you want and crave bad food. So this was published in the journal Obesity, and so we can conclude that late sleepers and delayed circadian chronotype, those who are very much owls, had later meal times, poor diet quality, higher caloric intake in the evening, and higher body mass index. So a new way to think about this is that the circadian rhythms affect sleep timing. Sleep timing affects timing of eating. Timing of feeding can lead to a higher BMI via looking at these areas where we're looking at choices of food, types of food that we're eating that could lead to higher BMI. So it's not just sleep and so forth, but also, and not only that, what are they eating? They're eating these high sugar, high calorie things, drinking sodas at night. That can be good for your teeth before you go to bed, right? As well. So, and this is particularly relevant for younger adults and for teenagers. This study received a lot of interest from the media, as you can see. Eating at irregular hours might pack on the pounds. Eating late at night adds weight, and so forth and so on. And midnight sneaks more fattening than you fear. Finally, let me just talk a little bit about shift work. Are these your patients? How many of you ask your patients if they're shift workers? you're much better than most doctors are. So this is great. I mean, medical doctors. I mean, those other people. So these are people that are shift workers. Let me tell you why that would be relevant to your oral health. So many people, 25% of our workers are shift workers, and about 20% or so of those shift workers are actually going to have a lot of problem with their shift work. Healthcare practitioners being at the very, very highest. But look at all of these people. Really, in almost every industry now, we are such a 24/7 society. Why is this important? It's associated with morbidities, cardiovascular disease, higher risk for GI disturbances, neoplastic disease, diabetes, and metabolic disorders, stroke. I can go on and on about this. Why is this important? Look at glucose tolerance. This is 3 years. This is people on night duty. This is looking at fasting, blood glucose, and stress in daily life. All things are known to make people increase the risk for diabetes. Now look over here. Night duty, odds ratio, hazard ratio, 500 times more likely, 5.48 more times likely to, in 3 years, going from impaired glucose to diabetes. Stress in daily life, important too, but this is really huge. Circadian misalignment, stress, and sleep loss altogether create this risk. Stroke in women, this is from the Nurses' Health Study. You can see the odds ratio that the longer you've worked the night shift, the higher the odds ratio of having a stroke 15, 20, 30 years later. Okay? And for both confirmed and probable cases. If you don't care about stroke, maybe cancer. This is the same study, and also in men. It's associated with increased risk of both breast cancer and also prostate cancer. The idea there is that melatonin is not going up at night, it's got antioxidant properties and so forth, and that may be part of it. This is such a strong finding that the World Health Organization, WHO, has classified shift work as a potential carcinogen. And women in Denmark who's genetically not predisposed necessarily to breast cancer, who've been night workers, are being compensated as an occupational hazard. So circadian dysfunction has many implications for health and disease beyond that of sleep, many neurological disorders, and then I pose here, we talked about cancer, prostate cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic disorders, and I pose here really the question about oral and dental disease. This is your area, and I hope I can convince some of you that this is an important area for you to do some research in and to really begin to think about this. Because circadian timing is really a pathway to health and disease, both for prevention, which is very important for you, as well as for treatment, that it's not just for the brain, it is of the brain for also the rest of the body. And in every cell of the body, it needs to have the synchronization between internal rhythms and that of the external rhythm. We talked about here in the field the metabolic, the inflammatory processes, how circadian rhythms are related to sleep and obesity, some of the epigenetics. So this is now above the surface of this iceberg. We're beginning to recognize this. Lifestyle plays a huge role. This is like the Titanic, right? It could crash everything. It's about our lifestyle is moving in this direction. But what's below the iceberg is still how circadian rhythms affect neurology, a little bit in psychiatry, it's much, much higher, immunology, which is obviously an area of interest, oral health, not even on the radar scan. I hope that some of you will think about this. And that really what the circle is disease vulnerability and resistance. This is what the circadian system is doing. And I hope that in 5 years or so, we're actually going to have some real science in this area, in your area of research. And this is some of the people who work in my research laboratory. And the work was primarily done by Kaylee Barron, at least the metabolic work that I want to show you. And we also have to thank our NIH funding sources over the years. And we have a training grant specifically for sleep and circadian rhythms for fellows if they're interested in. So I'd like to thank you for your time, for your kind invitation. And I don't think we have time for questions, but I will be around after the break because I will not be here at 4. I have to take a flight back. Thank you.